Hello everyone, welcome to ACM Hackschool workshop series. So this is basically going to be our annual web development series where we'll teach you everything you need to know about HTML, CSS, and React. I'm Eric, I'm one of your code directors, and the other code director for this year will be Nare. So in terms of logistics, our weekly sessions will be on Wednesday at 7 p.m. in Perloff 1102. If you're there for the live thing, you probably know that, but if you're watching this recording, just know that that's when our weekly sessions are. We'll also have a Facebook event on the Facebook page for ACM Hack, so you can go there to look as well. In terms of curriculum, this week we're going to be covering HTML, CSS. We're going to be diving into JavaScript next week and React and more React things in the later weeks. Note that on week 8, we currently have no session, and that's because Thanksgiving break starts that Thursday, and we don't want to keep you here Wednesday night to learn coding. But yeah, feel free to check that out. In terms of the workshop structure, we're going to start off with a short welcome introduction at the start of our workshop, and then we're going to begin learning about a topic. Somewhere within that learning period, we're going to have a small coding exercise, and then we're going to have a quick 10-minute break in the middle. We're going to dive into another topic, once again, with another coding exercise. And finally, we're going to have a feedback form at the end, which we'd really appreciate if you guys filled out, because we really take the feedback into account and are trying our best to make the workshops as good as possible for you guys. So here are the links to the slides and README. So we recommend that you guys open these because we're going to be referring to a lot of the stuff on the slides, and README has all the info that you might need. We have a membership portal attendance code. So for those of you guys who are not familiar with this, basically ACM has their own membership portal where you guys can log your points for going to events. So if you go to the link shown on the screen, you'll be able to either create an account, or if you already have an account, log in. And our attendance code is Hackschool, surrounded with a slash and some less than and greater than symbols. So if you put in the code, make sure to format it exactly as it is on the screen. I'll leave this up for a few minutes or so for you guys to get into the portal and get that all set up. We also have the feedback form linked here, which you guys can fill out at the end. And yeah. All right, we're gonna keep going now. You can always check out the slides later on to get the code if you need it. All right, so for this workshop, we recommend that you guys have these two things. First of all is a text editor. So this is basically where we'll be putting in all of our code and writing up our code. Specifically, I'll be using VS Code in this workshop, but feel free to use any text editor that you guys may prefer. You guys can also just download VS Code if you like to follow along. We also recommend that you guys have Chrome open or Chrome installed, and that's because when we open the HTML pages on
on Chrome, you'll be able to see what we're talking about. And so similarly, if you're developing on your own, you may need to open in a web browser. Chrome is just the one we recommend because it's the one we'll be using. But if you are comfortable with another one, feel free to use that as well. Yeah. Was that? Yeah, that should be good. All right, so let's look at this page right here. What do you guys see? It's basically sort of a web page, and you may be wondering how this web page is really displayed. Well, this is CS31 web page, and it's coded using HTML. So in this workshop, we'll be talking more about HTML, how to write HTML, and yeah. So first off, let's talk about what is HTML. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So this probably sounds really confusing to you guys. You probably don't understand most of what this mumbo jumbo is, but let's break it down to make it easier to understand. First off, what is markup language? So markup language is basically a language where you're able to write text, but also annotate text. So we'll see in HTML later that besides just plain text, we also want special ways to annotate the text. And that way we can design how our web page is supposed to look. Now, what about the hypertext part of HTML? Hypertext was originally coined as a term back when people were first starting to create web pages. And basically what this means is that we want text that can link to other text. So if you think about like a URL that you click on any page these days, it'll link you to another web page. And that's what this hypertext is referring to. Obviously, we've come a long way, and text no longer is just contained in hypertext. So we'll see if you have this link, for instance, you can go watch Eugene Lowe's very cool cover of Slow Dancing in the Dark. So as I mentioned earlier, in HTML, we have ways to annotate the text that we are writing. And the way that we're going to do this is through HTML tags. So this is an example of a very simple tag. Basically what this tag is, let's break it down. There's a less than sign, H1, which is the name of the tag, and then the greater than sign. So you know that this is a tag because it's encapsulated by the less than and greater than. And this is basically saying that we want to have a tag for a header, since the H stands for header. So with this tag right here, we're gonna have a corresponding tag. And you'll notice the difference between the two is that the one that comes after has a slash before the H1. And what this signifies is that this is going to be the closing tag. So the first tag on the left is going to be the opening tag, and the second tag on the right is going to be the closing tag. Now, between these two tags, you can put more text. So in this case, we have the opening tag with H1, we have hello world, and then we have the closing tag. So as you guys may have guessed, what this will do is just create a header with the text hello world. So what you're seeing here is that we have the hello world plain text, and when we surround it with the tags, it will actually tell the HTML web page to render it as a header rather than just plain text. Here are a few other common tags. We'll be diving into, I believe, most of these, if not all of them, in this workshop. So you'll see that there's opening tags and corresponding closing tags, and also what they represent. So the P tag, which is meant for paragraphs. You have headers, and note that headers also go all the way to H6. So it'll be H1, H2, all the way to H6, and they basically become smaller as you go. You have the A tag, which is used for links, the LI tag for list items, the UL tag for bulleted unordered list, OL for numbered list. And finally, at the bottom, you'll see an interesting one, which is image. And you'll notice that there's no closing tag. And what this means is that the tag is self-closing. So if you look very closely at the opening tag, you see that the slash actually comes at the very end before the greater than sign. And what that means is that there's no corresponding closing tag and only this opening tag, which is self-closing. We'll be showing examples of this, so feel free to just not copy it down. We'll be showing you all of it in just a second. All right, so now let's go into coding our first HTML page. For this section, we recommend that you guys don't follow along, but rather work on it later on when we have our coding exercise portion. So what I'll be doing here is creating the HTML page, and then I'll just explain parts of the page, and you guys can create your own page later on in the coding exercise. So this is what VS Code basically looks like. What's noteworthy is that on the left here, you'll see all the files that I have. So I'm going to start off by creating a new file called demo.html. So within this HTML file, I'm going to start off by telling them that basically I want to write some HTML code. And the way that I'm going to do that is with a special tag that just says !doc_type HTML, which tells us that this is going to be a document containing HTML. Yeah. All right, so after that, we're going to have another tag for just HTML. And this is basically going to say our HTML code is going to start from this tag right here at the top, and it's going to end at this other closing HTML tag. Now, between these two tags, we can actually start coding the content and other stuff of our website. So I like to think of it as sort of representing like a human in a sense. And at the top of the human, we're going to start with the head, right? So there's going to be a head tag right here. And the head tag doesn't actually have most of the web page's content, but instead it's going to give some information about the page and do some of the linking that we have to do later on. But for now, all that we want to define in this head tag is that we're going to have a title. So this title tag is going to basically represent what's displayed on the top of a tab. So if you open a tab in like Chrome, for instance, you'll see at the very top that there's some name for the tab. And we're going to define that in here. For this demo, I'm actually going to create a Jimin's Abs fan page. If you guys know who Jimin is, if you guys don't know who Jimin is, actually, he's just a member of BTS. And I'm going to make the tab's title Jimin's Abs fan page. All right. So just to show you guys that this is working thus far, I'm going to go to the actual page and show you guys it. So we see here at the very top, you'll see that the title is Jimin's Abs fan page, which we just defined in the head tag a bit earlier. You'll see that the page is still blank since we haven't defined any of the actual content on the page yet. So now what comes after the head of a human? Well, you have the body. And similarly in HTML, we're going to have the body tag, which is basically going to say this is where most of the actual content on our page will be. We'll start off with a few of the tags that we already dove into. So for example, headers, I can say like, I'm a big fan of Jimin. And once I save this file, I'll go back to the browser and you'll see that nothing has changed yet. And the reason for that is that every time we make this change in the HTML file and save it, we actually have to refresh the page in order to actually see what the changes we made pop up. So in this case, we see that the header is now showing up, which means we're good to go and we can continue with some more stuff. So just to show the smaller header as well, we can just create another header with H2. And once I go back and refresh it, you'll see that it says Army as well. Next up, let's go into the paragraph tag. So this is usually used for like most of the text on your page that you don't want as like a header. So I'm going to write, my girlfriend did not make me write this page. All right. So another part of tags that I didn't quite dive into earlier is that we can have tags within tags. So you kind of see that right now with, let's say, this P tag being within the body tag, but let's put another tag within the P tag just to demonstrate that. There's this new tag, which I didn't cover earlier, which is EM. And basically this means emphasis, stands for emphasis. And it basically puts whatever text you have in the middle in italics. So if I have this here, you'll see that it shows up properly as well. Let me make this a bit bigger so you guys can read it. All right, let's do a few more tags. So next up, we're gonna have a button. And this is just gonna say, here is a button. And when we go back, you'll see that you have this button here, which you can click, but nothing really happens yet. So next up, let's go into the images, which is sort of a special case of the tags that I mentioned earlier. So you're going to start the tag the same way by just writing the name of the tag. However, we have this new part of the tag, which is called the attributes of the tag. So previously with the tags, we just put the name of the tag between the less than and greater than sign, and that was it. However, now that we have this new tag for the image, well, we want to actually put what the image will be displayed, right? And in this case, we don't want to have it show up as text. And this is why we're going to alter the attributes of the image instead in order to actually make the image show up properly. So we're going to use the attributes by just writing src. In this case, src is standing for like basically the source of the image. So now I can put a few things within the source. For this first portion, I have this page here of Jimin's abs. And I'm just gonna right click and click copy image address. And when I go back here, I'm just gonna paste that in. So it's a bit long and you probably can't see the beginning of the tag now, but I'm just gonna end the tag with the slash and then the greater than sign. As I mentioned earlier, this means the tag is self-closing and we don't need a closing tag for this image. But now I save this, I go back, you'll see that there's this cool picture of Jimin's abs on the page. Another part of the image that we want to change the attributes of is going to be the alternate text. So this is really good for accessibility purposes. For example, if someone is not able to see images, or maybe the image doesn't load, we want some alternate text that will be displayed or read in some way. And similar to the way that we did the source of the image, sorry, the link's very long, but at the end, we're just going to have another attribute that is just alt. And this stands for the alternate text. For the text, let's just say like Jimin's abs, since that's what the photo is. All right, nice. This is one way that you can display images within your page. Another way is to actually use a file that you have downloaded. So conveniently here, I have this PNG file called notphotoshop.png. And let's say I want to display this on my page. Well, I'm going to still edit the source of the image similar to what I did earlier. However, in this case, I'm just going to fill it in with notphotoshop.png. Note that the PNG file is also in the same folder as my HTML file, as you can see on the left side here. And this is why I can just directly refer to it. Now when I go back, you'll see that I have the image here as well. And it's a bit big. All right, now let's dive into the unordered list, which I covered earlier as well. But for this list, I'm going to make a list of Jimin's favorite foods. Yeah, question? What happens with the image tag that's not closed? Line 14. Oh, right, I forgot to close it, but I guess they like closed it for you. So the HTML is like kind of smart and it kind of knows that you want to close it. I forgot to write the closing, but that's my bad. But for this next list, moving on, we're gonna have Jimin's favorite foods. And as I mentioned earlier, the start is going to be denoted by the UL unordered list tag right here. Now, within the unordered list, we're gonna have more elements. So for instance, this is a list item tag right here. And I Googled this earlier, but apparently Jimin's favorite foods are meat, fruit, and stew, which is a weird combo, but we'll go with it. And now when we go back, you'll see that this header right here is what I just defined at the top to label the list. But here we have a bullet point for each of the list items, meat, fruit, and stew, as we defined in our HTML code. So I mentioned that this is an unordered list, and you can know that through the fact that everything was a bullet point. However, you also have an ordered list, which is going to be similar, except they're going to be ranked by like numbers. So if you imagine if you're writing like a list, you start like 1 and then 2 and then 3 and so on. So just to demonstrate that, I'm just going to copy paste the list over again. But instead of OL or instead of UL, we're going to use OL for ordered list. And you'll see here that we now have numbers besides the items instead of bullet points. Now, finally, the last sort of big item that I'm going to go over is forms. So in order to define a form, you just use form as the header tag, or not the header tag, sorry, the name for the tag. And within a form, you're going to have a bunch of inputs, and these are defined through the input tag. So we're going to have to edit the inputs attributes, similar to what we did for the images. In this case, we're going to want to define what type of input we want. So in this case, the first type that I'm going to cover is text. So you can think of it as a form and you want someone to put in text into your form. This one's also going to be self-closing, so we can just end it with the slash and then the greater than sign. You'll see at the bottom, the form doesn't actually like show up that much, but the input here is definitely for text. So I can say like, I love Jimin in the placeholder. In fact, we can actually define some placeholder text in the case that they haven't entered any text yet through editing the placeholder attribute. And in this case, let's say that we just want their name, for instance, instead of saying like, I love Jimin. And the next input is going to be a range. So this one probably sounds a bit confusing, but if I save this and go back, you'll see that basically what shows up is this little slider where you can sort of input like a range. So if it was like something like on a scale from like 1 to 10 or something, this may be a useful way to record an input. Now the last input is going to be a submit. And the submit is also going to come with a value attribute. In this case, the value is just going to be submit as well. Now, when I go back, you'll see that they basically have a button here with submit. And all it does right now is just refresh the page. But you can make it do cooler things later on, which we'll cover later on in the workshop series. So this is basically a quick introduction to HTML. I realize now that I kind of sped through things, so feel free to ask any questions. But now we're going to have basically activity time for you guys. So the activity is just to create a website using HTML yourself. As we mentioned earlier, this is probably best done through a combination of like VS Code and Google Chrome. And some topics that you can just create the page about. If you have like some hobby or interest that you want to write about, or maybe an about you page, or just anything that you'd like to create a website about. We're going to take around 10 to 15 minutes right now, just to give everyone some time to create their own web page. And I'll leave the code up for reference. And yeah, just feel free to code, ask any questions to us. We'll come back around, let's say 7:45, and then we'll have a break for 10 minutes after that.
All right, everyone. Break time's over, so now we're going to head into our second part of the workshop, which is CSS. Okay, so far we've added some content to our page, and we know how to make put different types of content on our page with HTML. But right now we can't really style it. So how can we do that? And you might be wondering, why do we want to give it style? Because it could look pretty nice by itself. But it looks admittedly kind of plain, and we don't have a lot of websites nowadays that don't have any kind of styling on it, except for the CS class websites, but that's a different story. So how can we add styling to our page? It's alluded to the workshop name, and I mentioned it before, but we're going to use something called CSS, which has a really fancy name called Cascading Style Sheets, which we'll break down soon. So what exactly is CSS? Well, CSS, just as a general definition, are rules that we can give different elements on our page, so the content that we put with HTML, some style. And about the cascading style sheets part, the style sheets just simply means that in our file, we're going to have a group of style rules that can change how the web page is presented. As for cascading, we'll go through that a little bit later because it requires some knowledge of what CSS actually is and what it looks like. So what can you do with CSS? I'm just going to show some examples with text, but in our examples, we'll go into what it'll look like with images and whatnot. So some things that you can do are center some text, give it some color, or make it bigger or smaller sizes. So how is our CSS going to actually be implemented into our HTML file? As you may guess, we might need another file to be able to put all our rules in that file. Typically, for a simple web page, we'll call it style.css. And to actually put it within our HTML file, if you remember that head tag where we had the title, we'll put this little link, this tag in here, to signify that we want to connect our style.css file into our HTML. So let's break down what that link actually is saying. So we went over what A tags are, which are the actual links in the HTML file, but how does it differ from this link? You don't use this link to actually put like text with links in it, text with the link in it. We use this to say that we want to describe the relationship with another file with our current HTML file. So the relationship here is that it's going to be a style sheet. So we're going to give some styling to our HTML file. And the href is really similar to the A tag. It's just the link or the location of that CSS file. Now we're going to add our rules. So what exactly is a CSS rule? Well, there's three main parts to it. And let's start to break it down. So we have a selector. And as we covered, there's different kinds of HTML tags. We have body, p, link, lists. That's going to be your selector. So you're going to select some sort of HTML tag in order to style it. Then we're going to add some curly braces to signify the beginning of like the actual content of the rules. So we're going to add a property. In this case, we put color, and we'll get into what color actually is. But just as a general overview, it's going to change the color of the text within the body. So the property is just a characteristic that we're going to be changing from whatever tag we selected. Certain elements have different things that you can change. For example, for an image, you can't really change the text color. But for most items, they might share like similar properties, some might not. And we'll get into some more properties later on. And the third part is the value, what you're going to actually change the characteristic to. So it may be numbers or strings or words or any other things that can be chosen to give that property a certain value. So let's get into an example very quickly. So right here is my HTML file, and it mostly contains stuff that we've already been through. Don't worry about like the nitty gritty of it. I'm going to show you what it looks like right here. Okay, so it doesn't look that great right now. I have some like very large images and then some very tiny text. and it's just kind of all cramped together. Just as an overview of what the site is, it's just like some basses that I like because I play bass guitar. So I just want to talk about them. So let's start to actually style them. So in our code, we're going to have something called style.css. And if we look at like the folder where all of this is contained, it's just going to be in the same folder as our HTML file. In this case, it's going to be css-demo.html, and we'll just have a style.css contained there. And you can make that file in the same way that you made your HTML file. So let's go into our CSS file. Something we can start with is we see there's a lot of p tags, so we have a lot of paragraphs within our demo. So what we can do is style the paragraphs. So what I can do is put a font size. So this will just change how big or small the actual font is on the page. So I'm going to give it something bigger than the default, so I'll just do 24 pixels. And you can test around with them when you start working with them, what size works best for you, but I'm just going to try 24 pixels for now. So if we go back to our page, we'll see that absolutely nothing changed because we forgot an important step. We forgot to link the actual we forgot to link the actual CSS file to the HTML page. So let's go back and do that. If you recall, we have to add the link into the header right here. So right under the title, we can just add link and put, sorry, I think it's rel, and then put an equal sign for the attribute, and we're going to put style sheet, and then put a space and put href, which will be style.css. Now if we close that, sorry, okay, and go back to our page, we'll see that our paragraph here has been made a little bit bigger. So now the CSS file is connected to the HTML file, and now we can start adding some rules to it to make it look a little bit nicer. And if we go down here, I have some other paragraph tags here that have also been changed. Okay, let's get into some more things. Another thing we can do is change the list items. So as you see here, I have some lists here. They're unordered lists, but it's kind of small and hard to read. I mentioned that you can put either numbers or words into the value part of the property. So for our list item, let's try putting a word in. And these are already predefined, so you can't just put like pineapple into the value, like that's not going to make sense. But as we see here, VS Code already shows us some options. Some text editors might not do this, and you can always find these online, but let's just try putting large, for example. So all our list items will be made a little bit bigger. So as we see here, if we refresh, they've been made slightly bigger than the default. And just for one more item, let's try changing the H2s. So just for context, our H2s are going to be our secondary header like titles. So the actual bases that I've defined are the H2s, just for context. So if I go in and put H2, and I'm going to add something called text decoration. What this does is you can either underline or strike through whatnot within the CSS file. So let me try adding that. And I'm going to underline all the titles. And just something that I didn't mention, but I want to mention now, make sure to end your lines in semicolon, because if you want to add more than one, which we'll see a little bit later, you will need to separate them with the semicolon at the end of the line. So now that we've saved this, let's go back and see what that does to our H2s. As we see here, they have some underlining, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit just because I can't really tell how it looks in the back, but just in case you can't see it, there's some underlining here and some underlining here. Okay, so that's some basic stuff that we can do with CSS, but let's get into a little bit more. Before I continue, does anyone have any questions so far? Yes. Oh yeah. So if we go back to this page, right here in the header, I put link, and then this rel style sheet href style.css. It's also on the slides for reference. But just to go through it again for anyone who might have missed it if I was going too fast, All this will do is link the CSS file to our HTML file. So we put this in the header because it's not really something that's going to show up in the content of the page. It's just information for the HTML file to know. Yeah. Yes. Before this? Well, it's supposed to be there because it's a self-closing tag. But I did omit that on the slides, which was my mistake. But I mentioned this to someone earlier, but some browsers can be kind of smart. So whether you omit like the endings or not, which I do not recommend omit the endings. I'm not saying that, but if you by accident do omit like the ending tag, some browsers like Chrome and Firefox are pretty smart. So they'll kind of know that you're trying to end it, then they'll autofill for you. So sometimes you might not miss it. But in this case, yeah, there should be an ending tag here. Okay. So let's get back into it. Okay. Sorry. So I've kind of been like throwing around a bunch of CSS properties at you guys while doing the example and while showing what the rules look like. But let's just get into a couple of them that you might commonly see. So if you have the slides open, there's a link here that will show you a full list, and it's like a huge reference sheet. And it can be kind of overwhelming, but here's a few that you might come across while trying to make a website. One is the color, and this just basically changes the color of the text. For example, you've seen me put like the actual color names, like you can put red or green or blue, but you can also put something here, and it's a little bit cryptic if you haven't seen it before. Let me just show you, for example, what that is. So what we call that is like a hex color code. So if I go into Google and just type color picker, I can zoom in a bit, and don't worry about like what the actual numbers represent for now, because it is a little bit involved. But something that you can do is if you want like a specific color, because a lot of the words are like very fixed colors, you can kind of just slide this around and get like whatever color you want. So like if you want some shade of pink, like some like pastel pink, you can kind of slide it around and copy this right here, this thing that says hex, and put that wherever we put the word originally. And you'll need to include the little hashtag in there as well. Okay, but just to continue on, we also have text align, which if you remember the slide where it had like a little bit of examples, you can center text or left align them or justify them. And if you've ever used Google Docs or like anything like that, like Microsoft Word, you've seen that you can like left align things and center things. It's the same way, it just centers it relative to the web page. The next one is font size, which we've used during these examples. Just simply changes the size of the text on the web page. Another one is width and height, which we'll see in a little bit, will change the actual dimensions of the elements that we have on the page. And here's a couple, like, we're going to go into 3 more, which you might not come across like when you're starting off, but they are pretty common as you go on. So there's border. So each element has like an invisible border, and you can change the width, style, and actually make the border visible with some color around the element using this property. Similarly, there's padding, which changes the space between the actual content and the border that it has. And there's also margin, which changes the space between the border and other elements around it. Now, you're probably sitting there being like, oh my God, this is so many properties. How am I going to remember this? Don't worry. I don't even have like 90% of them memorized. I don't even have like 20% of them memorized. A lot of people just use the reference sheet or like look them up. You do not have to memorize these at all. Some of them like you'll start to like pick up as you use them more, but just want to preface this with do not worry about it at all. So are there any questions at this point? And also let me know if I'm going like too fast or too slow or if anything. Yeah. Okay, looks like we're good. Okay, so right now, with all of our selectors, right now we're only limited to applying changes to like an entire element. So if I select a p tag, I'm going to be changing every single p tag that shows up on my HTML web page. Sometimes we don't really want to do that. We only want to change one specific one. Or we might want to change a couple things to look same. So like one paragraph tag and one header, we want to look the same. I don't know for what reason, but in that case, right now, with the way that we're treating the rules, it's a little bit limited. But thankfully, the people who made CSS knew about this, and they added some things called classes and IDs. So they can be kind of mixed up sometimes, but think of them kind of like being a student, right? Every student has classes, but not every, that was bad wording. Let me start off with saying that every student has an ID, and that ID is unique to them. On your Bruin card, you might have some sort of ID. Those IDs only apply to you. Similarly, in CSS, we have IDs that you have like specific stylings that you can only apply to one element. So let's say you want to find specifically just one p tag and nothing else. Then you can make an ID for that p tag and change it up, give it its own styling, and it won't affect any other p tags or any other elements really. Classes are kind of similar, except that you can give them to multiple elements. It's not restricted to just one element. So my classes example was that there's a lot of students that can be in the same class. It's not just limited to one student. So you can think about it in that way, that a lot of HTML elements can also have the same classes. Something to note is that IDs are more specific because they can be only applied to one element. And we'll see why that's important to know later. But yeah. So what did these actually look like in our CSS rules? Well, classes are prepended with a period and whatever the class name is. It doesn't have to be like the actual HTML tag. Actually, I would highly advise against that. I don't even think that's allowed, but you can just, you just make any kind of class name, which is more helpful if it's very descriptive of what you're going to be applying that class to. And you can put any kind of rules in it at all. We'll see this in a little bit, but you can also, you'll put this in your HTML elements to show what they are using class equals sign, and then in quotation marks what the class name is. You don't have to put the period in there. That's just for CSS to signify that it knows it's a class. IDs are very, very similar, except instead of a period, we use a hashtag. Again, you can put any kind of name that you want for your ID, any kind of rules in there, and it must be applied to only a single element. And very similarly in the HTML file, you do ID and then equal sign, and then in quotation marks, the name of the ID, omitting the hashtag. All right, so let's get into a little bit of an example. Before I go, are there any questions so far? Okay, cool. So let's go into our example here. So there's a couple things we're going to be trying out. One thing you might have noticed, if I go back to my webpage, is that a lot of these pictures are either like really big or really small. And I want to standardize the size of it because it looks really ugly like this. And like anyone who sees this page is just going to click off. So let's like try to fix that. We can use classes for this to specifically change some of the images. But I don't want to change this little GIF here. If you don't know where this GIF is from, it's from the game Stardew Valley. I don't want to change this image, but I do want to change all of my bases that are present here. That's why I'm not going to use the image to encapsulate all of the images shown. So I'm just going to make a class name. So start with the period and do bases. And within here, I'm going to add some rule. I mentioned width on one of the slides, and that's actually what we're going to use to change the size of the image. So I'm just going to put width and put 200 pixels, which seems a little bit big, but for images, you'll see that it actually works out. Oh, before I continue, I forgot, I have to put it on my HTML items. So I have, I know it's a little bit messy with all the links, but here are the images for my basis. So just before the source, I'm just going to put class equal sign and then basis. Make sure you put the quotation marks around your class name as well. And I'm just going to do this for all of the bases present here. That is a big image. Okay. Now if I save this and I go back to my web page and I refresh, that looks so much nicer. Now they're all standardized to the same size. Obviously the height is not going to work as well. I can actually show what happens if I try to add the height. It's going to act a little bit strangely. It's going to squish it down a bit. When you're using CSS with these kinds of things, you kind of have to play around and see what works. But just to make them all the same width, just for clarity's sake, I'm not going to use the height. I'm only going to use width. Okay. So that's one example, but I have a couple other things that are kind of sticking out to me on the page. For example, this apple is huge and it's kind of taking over the rest of the title. So I'm going to add an ID just for the apple so that I can modify it. So I'm going to do hashtag apple. And within here, I'm also going to change the width of that. So I'm going to change it to 40 pixels. Again, you might have to play around with these numbers. But I've already tested them, so I kind of know what looks good with the files that, with the images that I've created on the HTML file. So I'm going to have to add it to my image here, which is this little GIF. I have it contained within this H1. So I'm going to do ID equals and then apple. So now that I've saved that, if I hop over and refresh the page, now it's a little bit more manageable size. It might be kind of hard to see from the back. I'll zoom in a little bit, but I've made the apple a tiny bit smaller, so it's not like totally out of proportion. Okay, so we're just going to do one more thing for this example. Let's try changing some text because I've only been changing images so far. So let's try changing the description, which is going to be like the title and that paragraph there. Actually, let me go back to show you before I continue. I have this H1 here and I have this paragraph here, but I don't really want to change this other paragraphs down here. I just want to change this one specifically, which is why I'm just going to use a class so I can apply it to my H1 and my paragraph without changing anything else that shares those same tags. So for description, I'm going to make the color blue because that's my favorite color. And I'm just going to align the text to the center so it looks nice and pretty and stands out from the rest of the text that's sitting there. Now, before we refresh the page, let's go back to the HTML file and add it to our H1 and our paragraph. So very similarly to how we added it to the base images, we're just going to do class equals and do description, and similarly to the paragraph. Something I just want to point out, because I didn't explicitly say it, you do not have to put the class name in the ending tags as well, just the opening tags. Oh, don't put the class name and IDs in the ending tags, only in the opening tag. Yeah. So now our H1 and this paragraph have been center aligned and turned blue without actually modifying any of the paragraphs or other elements here. Okay, before I continue to the next portion, are there any questions about what I've done on the example? Okay. Also, feel free to raise your hand like during while I'm speaking as well if anything comes up. Okay. So I kind of glossed over what cascading was, but I do want to explain what it is. It can be a little bit complicated, but I'm just going to use some simple examples just to display what it is. So let's say you defined this body twice. So one time I wanted to make the text a color green, and then I wanted to make it a color pink. What would CSS do in this situation? How does it know which one to use? Well, the cascading part of the CSS name is actually one of the properties. I kind of don't want to call it that because we have the parts of the rule are called properties, but it's just one of the parts of CSS where it will choose the last defined thing, the last defined rule as the actual rule that will modify the body. So in this case, and I'll show you where I got this in a little bit, but it will be choosing the pink one, which if I go back, was defined last rather than the green. The cascading refers to how it'll cascade down and choose the last defined rule for that selected element. Similarly, and if you recall, I mentioned that IDs are more specific than classes. What the hell does that mean? Well, this refers to specificity. So let's say I have this div, and I do realize we didn't cover what a div is for the HTML, but just to give like a brief description of what that is, it's just a container. For our purposes, just consider it as a container. So let's say I put the text, I try to put anything in the div as a text color red. Then I have some class that's color blue, and then I have a ID that's a color green. Well, with this, like, I can't really say much, but let's say it was applied to some HTML, to the actual div as like the class and the ID were put in there. In this case, it will use the most specific defined rule as like the precedence. So in this case, it will use green, which is the ID, instead of the class, which was blue, or the div, which was red. So there's an order of precedence. IDs are more specific than classes, which are more specific than HTML tags. And why am I mentioning this is in the case that you put you modify a body, but then you put like an IDs somewhere in there and it doesn't align with what you put for the body, don't be confused. It's because the ID has modified whatever is in that body to be a certain color because it's more specific than the div or than the body. Are there any questions about this so far? So the last thing we're going to be talking about for today is combining selectors. So a couple of selectors that we've covered, just to like recap, are the actual HTML tags, classes, and IDs. There's a lot, when I say a lot, of different ways to combine selectors, but here's some like pretty like simple ones that you can start applying if you'd like. One way to do this is to combine a tag and a class, which will just be putting the actual HTML tag and the class right next to each other, or with the class, two classes, you can put them next to each other. You might be saying, what does combining the selectors do? Well, we can see that in an example. So let's head back over. I'm gonna just keep this open, but let me head back over to this. And let me go to my style.css. So let's take off from here and let's look at one example of cascading, one example of specificity, and then I'll show about combining selectors. So for cascading, let me define a P. And why am I doing this? It's because we've already defined this P here with a certain font size. Now, if I put this font to be something a little bit larger, and I save this, when I go over to this page, notice how the P's are this size, or I should use these ones down here. And then they're this size, but then they grow a little bit bigger. That's because CSS has chosen the last defined P rule instead of the one that I've defined earlier. And that little like box that I was showing earlier, you can do that on Chrome by like, for example, selecting this like some word in the P tag and clicking inspect, and you'll get all this like ton of mumbo jumbo. But if you go to elements and you look over here, I can see, can I make this a little bigger? Yes, I can. Oh, okay. So as we see here, it has this P. Oh, I am not sure how to make this bigger. So oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay. We have this P here that is crossed out and says 24 pixels. Remember, this is the very first thing that we defined in our CSS rule, but it's crossed out because now that I've redefined the P tag, there's now the 30 pixel rule that's dictating how big this should be instead. So now CSS is going to be using the 30 pixels instead. Let me exit out of this. And let me go back to my code. So that's an example of cascading, but what about specificity? So if I have this H1 and I put color red. Now, why am I doing this? Because recall that we had a class here called description that made the header blue. Now I'm trying to redefine it to be red. If you recall from the slides, what will happen in this case is that it's going to stay blue instead of red. And we can see that if I refresh the page, that it's still blue instead of red. And I can prove this is true by going into the inspect element once again. And just for clarity's sake, because I'm not sure how well it's showing in the back, but once you click inspect, there's going to be something called styles, and that's where I'm looking to see this. So if I scroll up a little bit, we can see that looking at this H1 here, it has the red, but it's crossed out. But this description is not crossed out over here. That's because classes are more specific than regular HTML tags. So they're going to, the rule in the description is going to take precedence over this H1 rule over here, and it's going to remain blue. So those are some examples of cascading and specificity, but let's get into some combining selectors. So I'm just going to define something called p.description. Recall that to combine HTML tags and classes, you just put them next to each other like this. And I'm going to change the font family. So you can add different font families, but there's some default ones. What font family is just, for example, on Google Docs, like, you know, there's Times New Roman and Arial and Georgia. That's basically the font family. Don't worry too much about the values that are going to show up when I type this. I already had this prepared, but feel free, like when you're doing your own research, to look through the CSS references and see what you can do with the font family. So for example, I'm just going to add like some Gill Sans because I was messing around with this earlier and it looked kind of nice. So I wanted to add that to my page. So what is this p.description going to change? If we go into our HTML file, we see that this paragraph right here has the class description. So anything that has is a p tag and has a class description defined to it will have this new font applied to it. Whereas like another p that I had down here will not have it applied to it because it doesn't have the class added as well. So I can see this when I refresh the page. It is a little bit similar to the previous font, but if you trust me, it is different from the fonts around it. Whereas if I go to the p down here, it's not going to have that font. So that's an example of combining selectors between the HTML tag and the HTML class. Let's try combining two classes. So I'm going to make a new class called feedback. And I'm going to give the text in it a color red and a font size of 50 pixels. So just to restate this, you can have more than one rule. I'm just showing one rule for just for demonstration purposes, but make sure if you do have more than one rule, or even if you do have one rule, to end each line with a semicolon so that it can separate each of the rules. So this is a new class. I haven't applied it yet, but I'm just going to make another combined selector using feedback and something I'm going to call Halloweeny. You do not have to, from my experience, you don't have to redefine this earlier, but it's more often than not, you're going to have two defined classes that you're going to be combining, but I'm just doing this for demonstration's sake. Since it's close to Halloween, I want to make some orange text on my page. And I'm going to use something called text shadow, which is going to add some like backdrop shadow to the text. And what I'm going to add here is 3 pixels and 3 pixels, which is defining like horizontally how much shadow there's going to be and vertically how much shadow there's going to be. And then I'll just make it black to match the October theme. Now, if I go back to the HTML file, I'm going to apply this to the paragraphs down here because I've been kind of neglecting it over here. So I'm going to add to this one a class of feedback. And in case you can't see the text, it says leave some feedback on what you think of the site. It's this one right here. And the one below it is a separate p tag that says do it for a free sandwich from the study, because study sandwiches are really good. And now I'm going to give this p tag, the one about the free sandwiches, 2 classes. And the way that we do this is by adding the first one and then just adding a space in between, then putting the second one. So in the eyes of the HTML, this one has these 2 classes of feedback and Halloweeny, whereas this one only has feedback. So when we save this and go back to the HTML and refresh, while this one has whatever rules I applied from feedback, it's not going to have the Halloweeny rules as well. From the combined selector for Halloweeny, I made the text orange and gave it a little bit of a drop shadow, which is why this has been applied to it rather than the red text. So those are just just a couple examples of how you can combine selectors and what cascading and specificity really means for your CSS file. Okay, now we've gone through the core CSS content. So now we're going to have another activity, and we'll have it be another 10 to 15 minute activity. If you have the slides open, and in case you missed the link, you can open the README here, and there will be a slides link there as well. Feel free to open the CSS reference sheet. First, try to add like some basic color and increase the font size to your text on the page. Then maybe try using some classes and IDs throughout the page. Then just have fun. It's your website, so I don't want to tell you exactly what to do, but just try these out. Try using the reference sheet and like look for some more new properties, and see if you can apply them to your page. So yeah, take 10 minutes, 15 minutes to do so. Feel free to raise your hand to ask for any questions. We'll have some officers going around to answer those as well. All right, everyone. Thank you for those who stick around. I'm just going to say this one more time. We do have a feedback form. So if you'd like to have a chance for a raffle, there is a question that you can fill out. But also fill out the feedback form just to let us know how the workshop was, what we can improve on and whatnot for future workshops. And we hope to see you next week. We're going to be going over Intro to JavaScript. Same time, this room, but next week on Wednesday as well. All right, thank you everyone for coming out.